All right, welcome everyone. It's great to see you here on a rainy Friday afternoon. This is a panel in the latest panel in our series on Election Matters. This is the first of Election Matters 2024 with a focus on challenges to election administration in this election year. My name is Barry Burden. I'm a professor of political science here at UW-Madison. I'm director of the Elections Research Center and so glad to have you all here. This event is co-sponsored by the Elections Research Center and the State Democracy Research Initiative here at the law school at UW-Madison. Thanks very much to the staff and students at both organizations for making this all together, and to our panelists for making the trip. Also to Wisconsin Eye, who's here covering the event. The event is sponsored by Stafford Rosenbaum LLP, and you'll hear more about them in just a moment. They're sponsoring all of the Election Matters events that are taking place this year. If you're interested in this kind of activity, I encourage you to sign up for the newsletters from either the ERC or the SDRI, or follow one or both accounts on social media. That's the best way to keep up with all that is happening. 2024 is going to be the first presidential election since the tumult of 2020. That was an election that Nate Persily and Charles Stewart described as both a miracle and a tragedy. To survive all the difficulties of that election and yet for it to be as successful as it was. The things that we thought were concerns going into that election were primarily about security of the voting systems and voter registration databases, and so much work was done to prepare, and then there was a pivot that happened in March and April of that year to voting by mail, to accommodating a pandemic, to making up for lost personnel in poll workers and others, to dealing with legal challenges and changes to the law throughout that season, to the aspersions and challenges to our election officials, right up through the counting of the electoral votes on January 6th. So 2024 presents a real test as the first presidential election since that time. So today our panelists will be talking about the challenges we are likely to face around the country this year, but hopefully also some reassuring news about some successes in preparation that put us in a good place to pull off a successful election cycle. I want to introduce first Doug Poland from Stafford to introduce our panelist. Doug is a partner at Stafford Rosenbaum LLP. There he co-chairs the election and political law legal advocacy group with Jeff Mandel. I think Jeff's also here. He's involved in multiple policy areas in litigation in particular, has been active in both state and federal courts. But for our purposes, it's important to know he's been involved with a number of high-level redistricting cases in state and federal court, including the US Supreme Court, cases dealing with absentee ballots, ballot access for candidates, voting rights, and a variety of other topics in that area. He is also co-founder of Law Forward, a nonprofit legal advocacy group focused on election litigation in Wisconsin. So welcome, Doug.
Thanks, Barry. Before introducing today's speakers, I'd like to thank the University of Wisconsin's Elections Research Center, excuse me, and the State Democracy Research Institute for putting together today's program and for their ongoing commitment to the Election Matters series, which is now in its third year. Those of us from Wisconsin are mindful of the Wisconsin idea, a principle that education should influence people's lives beyond the boundaries of the classroom. The excellent academic work of the Elections Research Center and State Democracy Research Initiative are examples of the Wisconsin idea in action. And our election and political law practice team at Stafford Rosenbaum routinely draws on the work of both as we conceive of and prepare redistricting, voting rights, and election administration lawsuits in our trial courts, present arguments to the Wisconsin Supreme Court, and write briefs for submission to the United States Supreme Court. We are thrilled to provide financial sponsorship for the Election Matters series. And now on to our speakers for today's program. And I'll introduce them from your left to your right. Professor Ned Foley holds the Ebersol Chair in Constitutional Law at The Ohio State University, where he directs its election law program. He's a member of the American Law Institute and as reporter for ALI's Project on Election Administration drafted Principles of Law, Non-Precinct Voting, and Resolution of Ballot Counting Disputes, which provides nonpartisan guidance to resolve election disputes. Professor Foley has authored many books and articles addressing U.S. elections law and history, is a contributing opinion columnist for the Washington Post and served as an NBC News election law analyst for the 2020 election season. Alice Miller is the election administrator with the National Association of Election Officials Election Center. Ms. Miller served as the executive director of the DC Board of Elections from 1996 to 2008. In June of 2008, Ms. Miller was selected to serve as the chief operating officer of the United States Election Assistance Commission, where she oversaw all day-to-day operations and served as the acting executive director for 3 years. In 2015, Ms. Miller returned to the DC Board of Elections, where she again served as the executive director until August of 2021, when she stepped down to become the senior policy advisor to the executive director. Rachel Ori is a senior associate director of the Bipartisan Policy Center Elections Project, where they are responsible for the organization's election administration policy development, state and federal advocacy efforts, and the task force on elections. Their research focuses on evidence-based and data-driven reforms that meaningfully improve our elections ecosystem. Ori obtained their Master of Public Policy and Certificate of Data Science from George Washington University. Before joining BPC, Ori supported research efforts at the Brookings Institution's Governance Studies program on topics of congressional oversight, election administration, and the Federal Reserve. Professor Mindy Romero is a political sociologist and holds a PhD in sociology from the University of California, Davis. Professor Romero is a research assistant professor and the founder and director of the Center for Inclusive Democracy at the University of Southern California's Sol Price School of Public Policy. CID is a leading nonpartisan research center focused on elections, voting behaviors, and electoral and political participation. Professor Romero's research focuses on political behavior and race ethnicity and seeks to explain patterns of voting and political underrepresentation, particularly among youth and communities of color in California and the United States. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to our panel of speakers.
All right, this is an impressive group. I hope you got that message. So let's talk about the format for today. We're going to allow each panelist to make about 10 minutes worth of comments. We'll work through them, and I will play the role of moderator throughout the session. I will also be a shadow panelist. After the four of them speak, I'm going to make some comments about election administration in Wisconsin in particular this year. That sort of builds on what they have to say. The Q&A afterwards, we encourage you to hang around and be part of that. If you are in the room, there are index cards scattered about with pencils. Feel free to jot a question, and we'll have folks coming around to collect those and bring them forward to me anytime during the session. If you want to raise your hand, we'll collect those so we have them at the end. If you are online on Zoom, we welcome you and we encourage your questions as well. Please use the Q&A function in Zoom, not the chat, not raising of a hand, but the Q&A function so that we can take your cues and give you some A's. Following the session, there will be a reception outside, and so we hope you, if you're here in person, you'll hang around, network a little bit, follow up with questions with the panelists. We'd love to have you be part of the conversation afterwards. And then finally, this lecture has been approved for 1.5 Wisconsin CLE credits by the Board of Bar Examiners. If you are attending in person, there are CLE sign-up sheets here in this part of the room. Please sign up so that we can give you credit for attending. If you are attending virtually online, please listen for the passcode that I will give around 4:05 p.m. Central Time. That will give you, and then you'll be a link posted in the chat. You will go to that Google form link and enter the code by 5 p.m. Central Time in order to get credit for attending. So let's move to our panel, and why don't we start with Rachel?
Thank you so much, and hi everyone. It's lovely to be here. My name is Rachel Ori. As they mentioned, I manage the Elections Project at the Bipartisan Policy Center. We're a DC-based think tank that works across a number of different issue areas, but I head up our work that focuses on election administration policy, looking at how we can create durable bipartisan policy solutions that meaningfully improve the election process, trying to look at creating a safe, free, and fair election system. So I'm going to focus my remarks today on the election information environment. drawing from some recent BPC survey research to show that it's really our collective responsibility to try to rebuild trust in election outcomes. I think that as the election administration field has been met with increasing challenges since 2020, sometimes conversations within the ecosystem make it seem like it's solely election officials' job now to try and rebuild trust among the public. And our research shows that it truly does take a multi-stakeholder collective process. I'll also discuss some concrete steps that election officials can take to help ensure a trusted and trustworthy elections this year. But because I'm going first, I'll try and frame this conversation with some context. First, the US is one of many, many countries around the globe that are going to be holding elections this year. A record number of voters are going to be heading to the polls in 2024, with more than 50 countries comprising more than half the globe's population set to hold national elections in 2024. This coincides with the wide and growing availability of sophisticated AI technologies that create a critical inflection point that are going to test both the resilience of democratic structures and tech companies' abilities to scale their tools responsibly. And meanwhile, since 2020, we've witnessed a coordinated campaign to undermine trust in election processes and outcomes in the United States. This campaign has undermined public confidence in election outcomes. It's also contributed to burnout and threats and harassment among election administrators, those responsible for keeping our elections running well year in and year out. Election officials are already under-resourced and overwhelmed, but now they're facing unprecedented public records requests and inquiries from voters that risk perpetuating burnout and turnover as we approach a critical election year. In some ways, this risks becoming a self-fulfilling cycle as we see experienced election officials who leave their roles due to threats and harassment and burnout. It creates an opening for inexperienced election officials who might be more likely to make mistakes. While I believe that the ultimate result will still be trustworthy regardless, those small mistakes or errors risk being capitalized on and becoming fodder for conspiracy theories to spread. So in light of these new challenges, there is this increasing pressure on election officials to not make mistakes and to be this kind of public spokesperson in a critical election year. So to ground this discussion, I want to show you some recent BPC survey research. We did a national survey in December of 2023, trying to better understand the information environment. There are a lot of claims made about voters' trust, where they get their information, who the right messengers are, but we really wanted to understand when voters want to learn about elections, where do they go? And so first, some good news. We did ask voters what their confidence levels were going into the 2024 presidential election. Across all groups, Americans do have confidence that their votes will be counted as intended in 2024. Americans are most confident about an accurate count of votes in their own community. We saw 74% of Americans who said that they are confident that votes in their community will be counted as intended, and that's across all political parties. Unfortunately, that does drop off a little bit at the national level. We see just 64% of voters being confident that votes across the country will be counted accurately, and this difference is most pronounced, as you might expect, between political parties. So only 50% of Republican voters express confidence that votes will be counted as intended around the country, and that's compared with 66% of Republicans who have confidence at the community level. So that's a 16 percentage point gap when you go from community to the national level. When asked about what voters are concerned about going into the presidential election, Americans point to, number one, misleading election information, number two, violence after Election Day, and number three are attempts to overturn election results. But the number one concern, and surprisingly slightly more among Republicans than among Democrats, was that concern about inaccurate or misleading election information. So to dive a little bit more deeply there, we asked voters where they get their information from, both from what sources. Think about those like mediums or channels, television, social media, search engines, and what people or groups they look to. So through that channel that you might look to for election information, what individuals? Are they candidates? Are they media professionals? And so what we found was that Americans most often learn about elections from television. The number one source was national television, from social media, and then the third was local or regional television. So when you're looking at the channels, it is kind of what you would expect. When you ask about people or groups, just 18% of Americans said they would look to local election officials for information about elections. That put election officials fifth, ranking behind candidates, news media professionals, fact-checking organizations. And this is a notable decline because in 2022, BBC administered a similar survey where we asked the question a little bit differently. We asked voters where they look for information about elections, specifically in three categories: for how to vote, for how elections are run, and for election results. So when voters were asked for information about how to vote, kind of that very mechanics of where's your polling place, how do you register, by and large, the number one source they looked to were their state and local election officials. And then when we asked this a little bit more broadly, when we just asked about elections generally, the election officials fell to the middle or in some cases bottom of the list. And this indicates that election officials really struggle to break through in this extremely crowded media environment. And so while the public looks to election officials for certain kinds of election information, we can't expect election officials to be the sole messenger that election results are trusted and trustworthy. We need it to be a comprehensive, collective effort, particularly among news media professionals and primarily candidates. Those were ranked number 3 in terms of the people or groups that voters would look to for information about elections. And when we have candidates who are undermining trust in election outcomes, it makes all of our collective efforts to try and build trust in election outcomes more difficult. But while election officials can't mend confidence in national vote counts by themselves, there are steps they can take to preserve confidence among their community and to ensure election operations are still running smoothly and securely. So first, I think the most important thing that election officials can do this year is to get the basics right. I think of it as like a Maslow's hierarchy, with the bottom level being those core functions that an election office has always been doing and has always been doing well, right? Getting voters their ballots, getting voters registered, auditing results. When we have small issues and mistakes there, they often get taken up by media and then spread into that conspiracy theories. I don't know if any of you were following Maricopa County in 2022, but they had a printing issue that caused some issues with their tabulators at vote centers on election day, and that very quickly became misinformation to say that election outcomes weren't legitimate in Arizona. And so getting those basics right, not giving anyone anything to work with, will be essential. The second piece is election officials establishing themselves as information leaders, particularly in their community, so that when an instance does occur, both members of the public and the media know where to look. Maricopa County was amazing in responding to that incident. They had trusted spokespeople out there as soon as they knew what was happening, and they were explaining what went wrong and explaining that voters were still able to cast their ballot and that the election outcomes would not be affected. Finally, I talked a little bit about the turnover in the election workforce and it potentially creating additional opportunity for mistakes or errors. While that is the case, I have been really inspired by election offices nationwide investing in training to make sure that those new individuals who are coming into these positions have the skills and competencies they need to administer a secure election this November. And while turnover is a concern, it's also an opportunity. Turnover, when stable and well managed, is part of any healthy profession. And even for experienced election officials who have been doing this for decades, new challenges require new competencies. I have met many new election officials who are talented and determined and passionate about democracy. So rather than seeing turnover as a wholly inherent negative, I hope we can see it as an opportunity to foster a more diverse and talented workforce in the long term. So I think that's where I will wrap. I'm going to pass it back. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Rachel. Alice Miller, would you like to go next?
Sure, thank you. I'm happy to be here. Thank you for inviting me. As mentioned, my name is Alice Miller. I am a 30-plus year election official, have worked in the field at the DC Board of Elections and at the Election Assistance Commission for an extended period of time. As the, I would say, the one in the field and having been the recipient of some of the things that Rachel is speaking of, I will say that threats to election workers are real. They're absolutely real. I have experienced it, and that's kind of what I want to talk about. I've walked into my office after the 2020 election, and there was a brick thrown through the glass and shattered, all glass shattered all over our floor. And we're like, what happened? We never had anything like that before. We have been the recipient of threatening phone calls, both racially motivated as well as threatening calls to our safety and our physical being. So these things are real, and they're things that thrive and drive our officials, our experienced election officials away from the field. The threats include invoking violence on voting locations, government facilities, at public meetings. In our ballot drop boxes, we'll get calls that say there's going to be a bomb put in your boxes. We don't know where that is. We don't know that it's true, but we have to get the ballots. So imagine what that does to election officials who are trying to run around, pick up the ballots, make sure the ballots are picked up and voted and put through. Private sector vendors also get these same kind of threats, and all we're all trying to do is support the elections. So these are serious attempts to intimidate workers, but nonetheless, we hang in there and we try to get things done, and we support each other and try to reassure each other. The threats obviously are designed to undermine the democratic processes and the institutions in the policies that we stand for and that we support. We know that 2024 elections have been marked by toxic rhetoric, inflammatory comment, and just all kinds of things like hate speech, misinformation already, disinformation, misinformation. I think you all will probably know the difference between that and disinformation. Misinformation being something that is not necessarily meant to be untrue, but just mistakenly told, and then it follows a trend. The disinformation, someone intentionally transmitting wrong information and false information, and that those things grow and creates an environment of distrust and hate. Election officials have been victims of violence and threats. The mail, we have to go through the mail. What comes through the mail, for example, are ballots. And there are threats of, for example, fentanyl in the mail. So we have to set up all kind of safety protocols within our own offices just for the staff and individuals to make sure that we can count the ballots, that we can take the registration forms and register voters so that when they go to vote, if they go in person to vote, their information is at our polling places and all those sorts of things. So these things are real. We have put precautions in place. Fortunately, we work very closely with our federal partners and our local police and security individuals when we get these threats to try to follow through on them. And we have actually identified at least one individual who did make a threatening call to the office, and that has been dealt with on the level that it needs to be dealt with. And it's interesting because election officials, I want to talk a little bit about this, election officials work with a standard of conduct, and we all know that. The only thing we want to do is to work the process. We have no feel for who wins or who loses. We have in our community say win and win big, okay, because we don't like recounts either. So that's what we want. We want to see that. But we've started working with and have always worked with a mode of conduct, of impartiality, to create and have free and fair elections. And if that is something that the public knows and individuals who are trying to do these threats would understand, there would be a level of confidence knowing that we don't care. I hate to say it, we don't care who wins. We honestly don't care. You know, we're just impartial. We have a process in place. We want to make sure the process works. We have checks and we're transparent. You know, for the most part, we want free and fair elections. Recently, the Election Center has been promoting on a very national and wide basis our standards of conduct. There are 10 of them that has been put in place, and we have a toolkit. It's on the website for the standards of conduct. And I'm not going to go through all of them, but I'll just talk about one, for example. It says, I strive to conduct elections in a fair, efficient, and accurate manner, and I am accountable for maintaining public confidence in honest and impartial elections. And that kind of says it all. We try to establish clear protocols in advance, to adhere to guidelines and procedures that make the election process free and transparent to everyone. When new circumstances demand departures from established protocols, the changes are vetted with the relevant stakeholders and communicated closely to the public. We try to do that and make that available. The impartiality, carrying out official duties, election officials always try to provide the same level of service to candidates, parties, voters, and other participants in the democratic process. Promoting accurate information, election officials endeavor to educate the public on the election administrative process, including about the existence and safeguards to ensure fair and accurate and secure elections. One of the things that we do with respect to the equipment and all of our processes, everything's open. Anyone can come in and watch the ballot count. Anyone can come in and, for example, we have what we call logic and accuracy testing. All of the machines that are used for our elections are tested. Each and every election contest is put on all of these machines, every single machine that is used, and we have an open process for anyone to come in and watch and see these machines tested as we go through our logic and accuracy test. It is I don't want to say a quite boring process, but it is something that is needed. It takes weeks to do, and we do it before every election, every single election, and we open it up to the public. We make public notice of it. Anyone can come in, not a problem. We want you there. The other thing, and that's part of our transparency with the voters, and we encourage individuals to participate. So I guess I want to say, while we're bombarded with these threats and everyone seems to think that we're trying to, or not everyone, but there's a sense or a community out there that election officials aren't doing the right thing. Trust me, all we want to do is the right thing. We want the process to work, and we want to be able to go back and say, this is how we did it. We can check that the process works, and we can show you that it worked because of everything that we did in preparation for the election, which didn't start the night before the election, believe it or not. You know, it started months in advance, practically a year in advance of any election, do we start preparing for elections. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Alice. Ned Foley next.
Great. It is great to be here, and it's really great that American Airlines got me here yesterday, because it was touch and go there for a while. But I'm here now and raring to go. So as Barry said, this is the first presidential election since the last one. I won't repeat his points about that, but it also means that it's the first presidential election under the new federal law called the Electoral Count Reform Act, which was enacted at the very end of 2022 before the change in Congress. It's a bipartisan piece of legislation, and it's good. It's really the good part of the good news story is that this was adopted, but it means any new statute, when it first gets tested, is its first test. And for those who were around when the Help America Vote Act of 2002 was first tested in 2004, the tires really needed to be kicked, and you know, there were some unanticipated things. So I think it's important to try as best as we can to understand what this new law does and how it might affect the process this year. So to do that, I just want to give you a little bit of background of how we got this new law, where it comes from. what its key provisions are, and therefore what are the issues to kind of think about between now and November. So it is called the Electoral Count Reform Act because there was a predecessor Electoral Count Act that was adopted in 1887, so a long time ago. And the genesis of that statute was principally the disputed election of 1876 between Hayes, the Republican, and Tilden, the Democrat. I think if one wants to think about the totality of the relevant history, 1872 was a warning signal that 1876 might be even worse, and that's what happened. This was during the period of Reconstruction after the Civil War. The Republican Party at the time was the party that was striving to fight for civil rights in the South, and President Grant was using the federal army to protect the rights of the 14th and 15th Amendments, and there was a so-called Redeemer movement. The genesis of it was the Democratic Party trying to reinstate as much of the antebellum South as they could get away with. They obviously weren't going to reinstate slavery, but they were trying to come as close as possible to that, unfortunately. And so there was a huge political fight, both nationally and particularly on the ground in the South, about which party would control. The Republicans, the party of Reconstruction, or the Democrats, the so-called Redeemer movement party. And 1872 was the first signs of problems in this regard. And the relevant fact to know about that is that Congress, when it met to count the electoral votes during Grant's re-election, he won easily, so it wasn't an issue of the outcome. But the political fighting was so ugly in Arkansas and Louisiana that Congress refused to count those states' electoral votes, and they were just, out of the count because of all the problems that occurred with the running of the elections in those two southern states as the fights were happening. And Congress at the time used what was called a joint rule, meaning they didn't have a statute. Each chamber of Congress agreed bilaterally, because the 12th Amendment calls for a joint session. We all know about it. It's what happened on January 6th last time, where the joint session receives the electoral votes from the states and then proceeds to count them. 1876, they still didn't have a statute. They knew they had problems in 1872. And 1876 was an absolute disaster. Won't go into the details of that unless you want to in Q&A. And the key thing to understand is that despite that disaster, it took Congress 10 years to pass a statute knowing that they needed procedures. So 1876, and it wasn't like they were lazy and not working. They worked for a whole decade to try to come up with a suitable set of procedures. And 1880 was close, 1884 was close, and they were headed into the election of 1888, and they said, we've got to have a statute. So they cobbled together a compromise statute that they knew was imperfect, papered over some differences, and they said, this is the best we can do. We hope it gets fixed in the future. That's where we have to fast forward to 2020, and the same imperfect, ambiguous, convoluted statute that was adopted as a kind of Band-Aid in 1887 never got updated, and its problems were exposed in 2020 in a context in which there shouldn't have been any fight to begin with. I mean, after all the courts had ruled and rejected all the challenges the Charles Stewart Nate Persily quote is exactly accurate. It was a free and fair election under the most difficult of circumstances given COVID, but the loser refused to take no for an answer. We know the whole story, and pressed all the way to January 6th. And it was the imperfections of the original Electoral Count Act that caused the possibility that members of Congress could object. And then that's what led to It Will Be Wild and the insurrection and so forth. So thankfully, Congress realized that they needed to fix this, and there was a lot of election reform proposals on the table after President Biden came into office, and the Democrats controlled both the House and the Senate, but for the filibuster, and you may have heard about H.R. 1 and S1 and the whole omnibus effort to get like an 800-page bill adopted, and ultimately couldn't survive the filibuster. But the one thing that Congress was able to accomplish by the end of 2022, as I said, was this bipartisan Electoral Count Reform Act led by Susan Collins and Joe Manchin and a group of senators. And then it was agreed upon in the House, the Democratic-controlled House as well. And here's the really good news about this law is that if states follow their own rules and procedures, we should be okay, because the promise of the statute and the clarification that was put in, the new one that didn't exist in the 1887 one, is if whatever laws exist in state law in advance of the November 5th election are binding and controlling on the casting and counting of ballots. And as long as those laws are followed, Congress promises to accept the resolution. And if there's any litigation over the application of those rules, again, this is state by state. Every state appoints its own electors. Every state has a set of state laws on how to appoint electors. If those rules are followed, Congress won't second guess them. Again, Congress has to enforce its own promise in this respect. Probably, it would be a wild card if any lawsuit tried to get Congress to obey its own rules, but hopefully a bipartisan Congress that agreed to these rules will be willing to police itself in that regard. So that's the good news. And again, we hope that the public will trust the outcome of following rules. But at least if we have the rules followed, the resolution of the election will be pursuant to the rule of law. Whether it's accurate and fair, it's still pursuant to the rule of law. And that's, from a lawyer's perspective, that's at least the baseline thing that we have to hope for. The bad news, not the bad news, but the tricky thing is deadlines are hard deadlines under this statute. We can go into the details of how the deadlines operate if you want to really understand the mechanics, but the key point is the electors themselves meet under the new law this year on December 17th. That means that states have to complete all of their procedures and any litigation in state or federal court by that so-called drop-dead deadline. Otherwise, if they don't, it'll be like Arkansas and Louisiana in 1872. There is no extension beyond December 17th. Now, a partial good news in this regard is the structure of the statute is that the first certification controls unless it's superseded by a subsequent certification. And you were talking about recounts. It doesn't usually take 6 weeks, even a presidential statewide election, to get your initial certified count of the ballots. So it might be accurate, it might not be accurate, but that becomes binding on the state, on Congress, unless a recount or litigation then changes it, and then the court order supersedes and you get the new result, which is hopefully more accurate. So if those of you who remember Bush versus Gore in the 2000, this idea of running out of time, that's relevant too, because the first result will be right, you won't be disenfranchised like Arkansas and Louisiana, but the first result may not be the accurate result if the recount takes too long or the litigation takes too long. So there's some debate about whether or not you have to finish this by 6 days prior to December 17th. There is a relevant date, December 11th, in the statute, but it's not, that's when the governor is supposed to certify. But if the governor doesn't certify by that date, you can get the litigation to insist that we have a certification, and as long as that happens in the next 6 days, that will be what's controlling. Last thing, and then I'll stop. There was a lot of fear in 2020 about the idea that a state legislature might come in and try to just repudiate the counting of the ballots and impose its own appointment of electors. That can't happen either. The provision that might have allowed for that last time has been repealed. Instead, what exists is a provision that says if there is a state law enacted in advance to provide for an emergency that might happen on election day in terms of like a snowstorm, a hurricane, an earthquake, something that stops voters from voting on election day. If the law in advance allows for the polls to stay open, not just that night, but the next day or the following day, you can extend election day that way to make sure that everybody has the right to cast a ballot. But that's the only change that can happen. State legislatures can't repudiate the result afterwards, and you can't void the result and hold a whole new election, before December 17th. So I don't know, how many of you ever watched the HBO show Succession? Do you know that? There was an episode there about, in a critical state like Wisconsin, a whole warehouse of absentee ballots being burned before they were counted. That's not remediable under the ECRA, unfortunately. There better be copies of those ballots, or there better be an initial count, but you can't redo the election after it's been held. So, thank you.
Thanks, Ned. On to Mindy Romero.
Hello, everyone. So I don't have to lean over too much. I'll just hold it. Mindy Romero. I direct the Center for Inclusive Democracy at the USC Price School of Public Policy. I'm also faculty there. And just a tiny bit about my center. We are an academic, obviously, nonpartisan research center that does work under the democracy space. A lot of research on elections, on voting behavior, election reforms. And really, the mission of our center is to produce research that informs efforts aimed at both increasing participation as well as representation in the electorate in our democracy overall. As we think that a fully robust democracy, fully representative, inclusive democracy, leads to, or at least is more likely to lead to, better outcomes in communities, better life chances in communities, better policy. So, I was thinking about everything that's already been said, and we've covered so much today. I'll add a little bit here just to the conversation around what election officials themselves are facing. So yes, indeed, of course, and we work with election officials across the country with our data tools and in research projects and so forth. And we also hear, like everybody else, we know that election officials are facing a myriad of challenges, right, and have been for quite some time now. Threats to their safety, staffing shortages, training challenges, litigation, Public Records Act requests that are numerous and time-consuming, and sometimes absolutely all-consuming in terms of them being able to get their regular job done. Of course, their number one job, their priority job, is to administer an election accurately, fairly, to the law, whatever that is in their individual state. And that's always been a challenge. They've always faced, or at least in many states, faced funding challenges. But for the most part, their jobs used to be considered most people really didn't think a whole lot about what election officials did, right? The running joke is it wasn't really sexy. Elections weren't as sexy, and if you were an election official, people thought maybe you worked one day out of the year, right? What do you do the rest of the time? And people really just don't even think about what you do, right? And now, not everybody still, but many people think about what you do, and there's a lot of attention. A lot of it is negative, not all of it is negative. I think we've heard that many election officials around the country have also received, in addition to death threats and challenges and conspiracy theories, they've also received public support, right? And in some cases, recruiting poll workers is more positive because poll workers want to affect positive change, or at least now know that there's something out there that they can do, right? Become a poll worker when maybe they didn't realize that before. So there's positive and there's negative, but there's a lot of negative. And election officials, of course, need support in all of that in ways that they didn't need before. So they need to partner with, and they do, local law enforcement, right? Just for the safety aspect of it. And just on that note, I mean, I don't think I've run into one election official across the country, and granted, of course, I haven't talked to all of them, but just in our work, not one that hasn't received death threats or something significant, right? Small, large jurisdictions in swing states, in non-swing states, rural, urban, whatever it is, right? There's something that they've gotten. And so they need support with with law enforcement, with media, with the community. Basically, allies and partnerships are even more important. In trying to address the solutions around administering an election safely and securely, and one that people believe in, it didn't used to necessarily, that wasn't really the role of an election official, that people trust and believe in. As long as you do your job, and please correct me, but as long as you do your job and you're doing it to the letter of the law, for the most part, that people are gonna trust that and believe that, right? Now it's gonna do your job to the letter of the law, and what else can you do to try to help the public believe that you administered that election to the letter of the law and without bias, right? And so much of the solution to all of these problems is placed on the election official themselves. The burden is placed on the election officials themselves, right? What are they reaching out? What partnerships are they making? Are they engaging in? If they're messaging to the public, however it might be, through emails, through social media, how do they figure out the right messages, right, to maybe build more trust and to get people to believe that the election was administered fairly and to the letter of the law, right? And I think one of the things I just want to call out there is that we need to be very careful when we put so much of the burden on the election officials themselves, right? When their jobs weren't initially and still aren't today defined that way. And where they are all struggling with all of these things and many more. And don't forget policy changes that have happened. Sometimes it feels like whiplash, right? With the policy changes, they're trying to just tell their normal staff, their ongoing staff, their new staff, training them on, not just because they're new, but training them on the fact that there have been policy changes, right? And so much of that burden on election officials is something that they're not prepared for, they haven't been prepared for, they're not funded for, and it's really not a fair space to do that in, right? So am I gonna, like Maricopa County now is giving tours, right, regularly there, which are fantastic, right, to build trust. But do they have time for that? Are they funded for that? Should they, all these things that, and, so many of us, the researchers and others, will give election officials freely ideas of things they need to do. And again, they're not really funded for it, or maybe that's also not their best skill set. So I want to emphasize that. And then I want to move on a little bit to talk about another aspect of elections, which is critically important, is the participation rate, right? And the representativeness of the election. So indeed, for election officials, their primary job is what I just stated. We all know this. But for many people in this space, particularly advocates and community members, but sometimes the media and others, they're also looking to see high participation, high turnout, right? And there's questions around how the election is administered in a way that could, the concern is, or the hope is, right, that could benefit, right, the implementation of a policy, for instance, or the way outreach or education is done by election officials in a community that could benefit or disadvantage one group more than others, a disproportional impact, right, or a disparate impact. And for a very long time in this country, there's so much conversation with community groups, right, not everywhere, but many times, right, trying to figure out how to engage their election officials to do work that under their umbrella, right, under their umbrella, because there's an outreach and informational capacity for election officials to some degree, right, to make sure people know where to vote and how to vote, those sorts of things. Some election officials, some jurisdictions across the country take it further and have outreach departments, and they're actually really trying to also get people to turn out more, to help build trust, again, even before, obviously, the last few years, the last few elections. But so much of our engagement with election officials or the election administration space, historically, or a good chunk of it, not all of it, obviously, has been to sometimes criticize, sometimes hopefully partner with, right, and encourage and train election officials themselves in some form to engage the public in ways that will increase right? Overall participation and representation. And if an election official is putting out messages, right, around how and where to vote, that they're reaching everybody that they can reach. They're reaching those historically underrepresented by race, ethnicity, people of color, but also, because I know Wisconsin is diverse, but it's not as diverse as maybe California, right? But other historically underrepresented groups beyond race. So income, right? Disability status, language status, renters versus homeowners, people that we know by lots of research are going to be less likely to get those messages, right? And people that might be considering voting but aren't on the registration rolls, right? Or could potentially vote, right? That aren't going to get those messages at all. And I just think that now we know that so much of that work is deeply complicated given the current environment in a lot of different ways. One is that, and we need more research on this, and this is an area that I hope myself and my center and others will explore, but we are hearing, I hate to use the word anecdotal, but we are hearing from some election officials that used to be, at least to some degree, more engaged with the community, having regular meetings, right, that now have pulled back because of the people that show up at meetings. Because meetings have become not about what the meeting was supposed to be about. There's a lot of distraction, but also meetings have become a place sometimes to get threats, right? To stir up more conspiracy theories. Again, this is at least the perspective, right, that some election officials have. I can think of at least a couple counties in California that have severely pulled back. Others have expanded, right? But for some have pulled back, or at least altered how they engage with the public. I see some have, yeah. And we're just not really talking about that and what that means, because we need more outreach, we need more engagement, more communities that need to be reached, and because of the current environment, we see less, right? And maybe in some cases across the country, there could be also, I think most election officials are quite sincere in what they're doing or why they're not doing it, but for some it could also be something that they hide behind, right? Or is another reason not to engage, and, depending on their likelihood already. So I think that's one aspect, just recognizing the challenges for election officials. How am I doing on time?
We're close.
Okay, thanks. I thought so. I want to make sure. And then I think just, that's one aspect, but I think we also have to really wrap our heads more around the conversation around AI. So we've talked about misinformation and disinformation. I really think aside from the actual election results, at least at the presidential level here in 2024, the story of the election will be the story of AI. Because that technology is, and I'm part of an effort in California called CITED, California Institute of Technology and Democracy, that's looking at, among other things, right, but in particular, the impact on AI and democracy. And the targeting of AI efforts, misinformation driven by AI or fueled by AI technology, particularly on communities that are already disadvantaged in the communication space, but period. And the technology is just blasting forward at a rapid pace. Every few weeks, right, gets better and better and better. Off-the-shelf computers, people that can do so much, and then that by November will not be detectable to the naked eye. We see some examples now. We can kind of figure it out that that's not Taylor Swift. Maybe not. A few more months. Probably not going to be able to figure it out, right? And the robocalls have happened and all those sorts of things. And what this does for the long term, right, in terms of our trust in our institutions and the additional challenges that election officials have to face. I just want to pull that into the conversation too. And I will leave it there for time. Thank you.
Thank you. So good questions are already coming in online through the Q&A function and here in the room. Before we get to the questions, I'm going to take a few minutes and give a kind of Wisconsin flavor to the conversation we're having here. We are the battleground state, I think, of the battleground states. So it's important what's going on in Wisconsin. First, some good news. There's good news. The 2022 midterm elections, smashing success in Wisconsin and nationally. No violence to speak of, no difficulties with election equipment, no significant litigation or challenges. In Wisconsin, there was both a governor's race and a Senate race, and different parties won them, and the losing candidates conceded, and it all happened essentially as it should. And that was the first run since 2020. So it's a very strong start to what we're likely to see this year. I would say our system has proven quite resilient to the challenges that have faced it. Unlike some other states, I think the turnover of election officials has been lower in Wisconsin than what I have seen out of swing states like Arizona and Pennsylvania. Both the professionals who work those offices full-time, but also poll workers have been very stable in their participation. And some of the ambiguities of the law that were causes of controversy in 2020 in Wisconsin, for example, how to handle ballots being distributed by workers in nursing facilities, have been clarified. So the controversy around ambiguities, I think, has been resolved in some cases. So there's plenty of good news heading into this year's election. There are some pieces in motion where I think the news is unclear as to what's happening. There is a filing before the state Supreme Court that would try to bring back the legality of drop boxes, would do away with the witness requirement on absentee ballots, would make some alterations to the cure deadline for ballots after Election Day. We don't know where that stands. I don't know where that stands. There's some other litigation that's been approved in the state assembly that is awaiting action in the state Senate. And there's some terrific bipartisan pieces of legislation in that, including a bill that would provide text alerts to absentee voters so that they can keep track of their ballots. This is something that's done elsewhere. It's a no-brainer bipartisan initiative. There are protections for election workers in another bill. There's a fix to align the state schedule with the Electoral Count Reform Act that passed on a bipartisan voice vote in the Senate and is awaiting attention in the Assembly. We have a couple questions about that already. Any legislation coming out of the state legislature that has a partisan tinge to it is likely to be vetoed by the governor. It's not moving anywhere. But there are some things I think where the parties have really come together, especially in the Assembly, in really productive fashion. I have three main concerns going into 2024 here. One is that the state does still not allow any processing of absentee ballots before Election Day. Wisconsin will be one of just a handful of states nationally that have that prohibition. This is problematic because more people are voting by absentee, obviously, since the pandemic and continue to like that way of doing things. And there are a number of communities around the state that count all of those absentee ballots at a central facility, including the city of Milwaukee. And those ballots can't be touched. Essentially, those envelopes can't be opened and inspected until the morning of Election Day, while election officials are also doing other kinds of things. There was a bill in the state legislature to allow processing of the ballots on Monday before Election Day. Not counting, not tabulating, simply inspecting envelopes for signatures, checking for a person's felony status, opening the envelopes to flatten the ballots and prepare them for counting on Election Day. That passed fairly easily in one chamber, but appears to be dead, or at least on hold in the state Senate. Maybe there's time to recover that, but at the moment it's not moving. As you probably know, the late arrival of absentee ballots to the totals on election night or the morning thereafter has been a source of misunderstanding, suspicion, misinformation, and disinformation. So we are setting ourselves up, I think, to allow that to foster that again. So that's concern one. Concern two is the status of our state elections commission with its 6 commissioners, 3 representing each party, and the administrator. The administrator is still in her role and is a veteran election official, but has not been affirmatively supported by a vote of the state Senate, who typically would approve those kinds of things. It's a long story that those of you in Wisconsin know something about, but it really would be helpful, I think, to have an affirmative bipartisan vote. She has support of the commissioners on both sides of the aisle. It would be nice to see that in the state legislature as well, just to cement the support of our lawmakers behind the person who is the head of the infrastructure in the state. I could say more about that, but I think that's important. The third concern is, I think, the stress that our election officials are facing heading into 2024. Jess Esplin and I at the Elections Research Center did a survey of our state clerks in 2021 to ask them about their experiences in 2020. And they expressed very high levels of harassment, insults they received, kind of disparagement of their profession that they took umbrage to, high levels of burnout on the job, fighting misinformation and disinformation, as well as legal challenges and COVID and all the other things that were happening. They're very tired of changing their practices to adapt to new election laws and new rulings from courts, even if we think some of those rulings are good things. This can't continue forever. A surprising number of the clerks in our survey told us that They had been thinking about retiring after 2020 just as a natural timeline in their careers, but because of what happened, they decided to stick it out. And some of them are hanging around for an extra presidential election cycle to try to rewrite the ship. That's wonderful that they're willing to do that, but it also means there's going to be a departure after 2024, and the kind of stresses, financial constraints, and other things that are being placed on them are just not going to be sustainable. So those are my warning signs about Wisconsin this year. Okay, so let me take off my panelist hat and put back on the moderator hat and get to some questions. We've got a couple that have to do with funding. There wasn't much discussion about funding. One of the things that Persley and Stewart pointed to in their Miracle and Tragedy article was that there was private funding that arrived from foundations that's now banned in some states. There's a vote in April here that would start a constitutional amendment to ban private funding. I wonder if you all want to weigh in on the advantages and disadvantages of having the private sector and nonprofits play a role in the funding. Is there a prospect of Congress dumping more money into the system this year to be helpful? Where do we stand with dollars and cents?
I guess everybody's looking at me.
You're not alone.
So fortunately, in the District of Columbia, we at this point do not have our legislative body telling us that we cannot accept private funding. We did have a bucket of money support us in 2020, which got us through the election. I don't think we would have been as successful as we needed to be with a lot of things that we needed. Given the uncertainties of the 2020 election, we got significant funding from 2 private entities, and it helped a lot. DC, as you may or may not know, has somewhat controlled by Congress. And Congress tends to stick their hands in things they have no business sticking their hands in, like what we do. And so, with that said, they now have a bill out that is being feted, I should say, that would prevent us from accepting any private funding, especially from one particular source. I won't name it, but one particular entity that we would not be able to accept private funding for. I don't know where we are on the federal level with funding, quite honestly, but the election administration process is sorely underfunded, under-resourced. Facts. Without additional funding, there are just things that cannot and will not happen, but the expectation is that they should happen. The outside funding helped significantly, and again, I will say, given the idea in the perspective that election officials operate from a total impartiality point of view, the funding does nothing but help us get the process done and get it done in a fair, transparent, and free and impartial way. So we need it, we like it, we want it. If Congress leaves us alone, and if there's some, we'll take it.
So there were 2 main entities, at least, and I think it's CL and the Schwarzenegger Institute that put out one much larger than the other, but still both substantial. The idea was that it was obviously in COVID, right? Understanding that election officials had greater challenges, and the money was to help administer elections, but to open up. At least for the Schwarzenegger Institute, it was really targeted on opening up more polling places, giving money for more polling places. And my understanding for CTCL, it was the money could be used for additional polling places and or other administrative purposes. The bottom line now is, I think, despite kind of even separate or probably also influenced by the state bans that we've seen, is both of those entities are not planning, last I heard, not planning to put out any funding in this election cycle for the same purposes, at least. I think CTCL is focused on training election officials, other things like that. And most of the charges that we've seen, and I don't know the details within Wisconsin, so please jump in, but most of the charges that we've seen about this and why people have talked about and wanted to ban it is the idea that it was going to have a partisan advantage, right? Pure and simple. I know there's at least one study by Dan Thompson and colleagues looking at CTCL's grantees and actually did not find it benefited turnout at all, and didn't benefit one party or another, and it didn't benefit turnout, if I remember correctly. but acknowledge there, again, it could be other reasons, right? Administratively, these funds could be helpful. And the concern over I think a lot of the focus was on the opening of additional polling places, right? That was going to be somehow skewed to benefit, right, depending on their location, people that were more likely to vote one way or another. And we haven't seen any evidence to that effect. And the bottom line is, even aside from COVID, election officials, most jurisdictions across the country have been underfunded for a very long time. Really the focus, independent of whether additional private entities should jump into this space or not, the focus should be, and we've tried to see this happen, right, where there's additional funding at the federal and state level. So at the federal level, we've seen legislation, and in various states, there's been attempts. Here in California, there was a budget ask of, I think, $82 million for quite a while. A number of organizations, as well as ledge members, came together to really push that. And then our budget deficit happened in California, and so that's put aside probably for a very long time. So just acknowledging that the political, the charges of political benefit around this have not been substantiated in any way, shape, or form. And really the whole drive of it is because elections are underfunded. And it has real consequences in a COVID year or in a non-COVID year. Let me just give it over to you.
I'll just address a couple points that were asked very briefly. I think one, BPC does believe that elections are a governmental function and should be funded accordingly, but if you're gonna take away private funding, you need to step in. And we've seen a couple states do that, but by and large, they haven't. One other added side effect of the bans on private funding we've seen have been restricting in-kind donations or even discouraging any kind of assistance or partnership with nonprofits or groups that might be able to provide assistance. Or there was a while where we weren't sure if election offices were going to be able to use some of Microsoft's cybersecurity tools or accept pro bono legal assistance. So not only are you taking away this private funding, but you're making even in-kind support really difficult. And then on the federal funding landscape, last I checked, I think at best we might get $75 million of federal funding at some point this year. That is far insufficient. Mindy just mentioned an $80 million request for California alone, and so that's $75 million spread across the whole United States. Can barely do anything.
Can I add one tiny thing?
Okay.
One tiny thing. Also, just acknowledging the concerns around the in-kind. So there's just also all of that potential partnership has been needed again for a very long time, just to be able to reach communities with the general basic messaging around how to vote and why it's important to vote and how to trust an election. And so efforts to stop that, right, is just problematic for the ongoing needs that we've seen, right, and the ongoing partnerships that we've hopefully, right, have been trying to encourage happen for a very long time. That's it.
All right, before the next question, I have to do a little housekeeping here for those of you who are looking for CLE credit and you're attending online. Now's your chance to take advantage. There is a passcode that needs to be entered, and the word is ELECT. ELECT. Uppercase, lowercase, whatever you like, just enter the word elect on the Google form. Elect is the word. All right, this question has got to be for Ned, and it's about the Electoral Count Reform Act. Our audience is not completely satisfied that this is going to solve problems, and here's one scenario. Imagine that there's an initial count on election night that seems to favor one candidate. Then a recount is underway, and it seems to be tilting things towards the other candidate. Is it possible for a court, a federal judge, I think would be authorized maybe under the ECRA, to drag things out and essentially run out the clock to prevent the election results from being recertified or certified with a different winner? So can courts are thought to be helpful in this process. They're built into the law, but can they also be unhelpful?
Yes, unfortunately. Elections are run by humans, and while it's great that on the ground election officials are impartial in exactly the way you, Alice, correctly say, there are other humans involved in the process that we hope are equally impartial. But hypothetically, if a federal district judge in a battleground state enjoined the state's election apparatus from certifying the result, that would have the consequence of the state's inability to complete its certification in compliance with the ECRA. That's not really a new problem caused by the new statute. If that had happened under the old statute, that still, I mean, again, that's why I mentioned the Arkansas and Louisiana example, that we have a history. And believe it or not, little unique historical tidbit fact, in the very first presidential election where George Washington got every electoral vote, New York did not cast any electoral votes because it failed to get organized and get its electors to the right place at the right time. And so, there is no guarantee that states get to cast their electoral votes if they don't get their act together. Now, your hypothetical is that the state's trying to get its act together, but some rogue federal judge wants to upend the process and prevent it. If there is that kind of federal court order, it would stop the state from participating in the Electoral College. I assume that federal court order would be quickly overturned by the Circuit Court or the Supreme Court, and so would unlikely to ultimately disenfranchise the entire state from the process. And again, if that order had existed at any time prior to this year, it would have had the same effect of blocking the state's electors from meeting and participating.
So we're getting word that the Google form is not working for everybody who's online, so I think our Brain Trust is working on it. We're going to work on getting your permission there. The word will be elect when you get access.
Are you saying that it's rigged?
No.
We do our best. I think it was Rachel who raised this, and maybe Alice, the difficulty of getting out information from trusted sources in a noisy, complicated environment when there are other actors, campaigns, media. Can we say more about how election officials are supposed to do that? It can't be only their job, but they are at the center of all of that. Is it about work that is done before Election Day to sort of establish premises and do a kind of pre-buttal of things to come? Is it election night? I've seen efforts here in Wisconsin at trying to do some of that warning ahead of time about things that are going to happen that are totally normal, and yet misinformation still ensues when those normal things happen. Other thoughts or advice?
So, yeah, we try to get out as much information about how the process is going to work in advance. We try to do timelines about projection on when the first tally is going to come out. What we will do, for example, is we will count all of the early absentees right at 8 o'clock when the polls close. So if we're counting all the early absentees when the polls close, that's everything that we have in, because we can do that in DC. Fortunately, we're not Wisconsin. We have already processed, opened those, flattened those, and have something in place where we can count all of our early absentees. We will put out, between 8 and 8:15, for example, early absentee results should be released. And then we'll just go through and we continue to release results as the results come in on election night. All other information in terms of media information that needs to be had, we'll have stuff up on our website where individuals can go to watch the results come in, where they can go to watch the ballots being counted. We try to put all of that information out in advance as the trusted source, so to speak, hoping that the members of the public will listen and take that in and follow us. Doesn't always work. And I will give you an example, a real example. Early voting, for example. Our early voting stops this year for our primary. Our primary is June 4th. We will stop early voting on the Saturday before early voting. We have a candidate right now who has a flyer out saying that early voting will go until Monday before Election Day. All right. That's her, all of her information is saying that. It's on her website. It's information that's being passed out. We have reached out to her and asked her to please, change it, fix it, correct it. Her response is, oh, I've already got it out. It's already out there. I've made more flyers. I'm sorry. Now, this is a candidate. But again, trusted source. So what we do, we will try to counter that in our media and in our messaging and our social media and all the things that we do. We will ask people not to rely on information they get from candidates, unfortunately, but to use the election office as the trusted source for information. So again, yes, we do try to get as much information out as we can about our processes and how the election night is going to work and things in advance of election night.
Rachel, you want the last word on this?
That would be great. Thank you. So a couple things in terms of what channels election officials can look to try and better communicate with the public. Obviously, there are existing channels. Election officials rely heavily on mail to contact voters about official communication. Increasingly, we see communication happening via text and email, which we think is great. In terms of this kind of broader information ecosystem, he mentioned trying to pre-bunk and fact check. A lot more research is needed, is long story short, in terms of whether those interventions are effective in preserving voter trust in the long term. But we think it's important that election officials have a very easy to access website with information on frequently asked questions, making sure it's a .gov domain. Particularly, I wish we had more time to talk about AI today, but it's important for the public to have those little checks to make sure that the source they're looking at is authentic. And by and large, we have election offices on .gov, but not entirely yet. And then a couple other options are finding community leaders who can serve as spokespeople for the election office that are trusted, that are out there, so it's not all on the election office in that community. And then also developing a social media presence for voters who want to contact the election office that way.
So there have been a few questions about AI, and we're hoping to have a panel on AI this fall as part of the Election Matters series. So feed us your suggestions for speakers we should feature as part of that. So we've come to the end of the formal part of our program. I want to thank the ERC, SDRI, Law School, everyone else for being here. Those of you who are here in person, please hang around and be part of the reception and ask your questions that we didn't get to during the formal part of things. Thank you again, and have a great rest of your day.